Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is the program bringing you discussion, news, views on religious liberty events and developments in the US and around the world and in our day and age. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty Magazine, and my guest on this program is Dr. Ed Cook, author, minister of religion, academic, and specialist in church-state affairs. Your doctorate's in that area.
Correct.
Let's put things on the line now. There's a huge development that anybody that watches the news must have caught not long before this program. The President of the United States, a man hitherto unknown to be religious, took it upon himself to very suddenly, without warning, say that the United States is recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and that shortly we'll be moving our embassy to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Was that justified? What does that mean?
Certainly I can state from the kind of at the outset is that it is something that drew a lot of attention, a lot of reactions to it, both pro and con. As far as the aspect of recognition of Jerusalem as the capital, in essence, from a purely political perspective, it certainly is going to draw the ire of Muslims and at the same time maybe cater to the preferences of the Jews. It's something that, as well, of course, Christians, evangelicals in particular, would be very much interested in that if that were to develop.
Do you think this Israel, the state of Israel, is happy with this? I'm not quite so sure.
That's, I would actually kind of look at that maybe as a mixed bag because there is an element of very conservative Judaism there in the state of Israel, and then of course there's also the more liberal aspect of society.
It's 67 war, they took Jerusalem. They've never moved their capital to Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. They know what it would do. So Trump has moved ahead of the state of Israel itself. They've kept the capital in Tel Aviv. Mm-hmm. So they've not dared to do this. They might want to. And the world has known a lot of woes, not just North Korea in the last few decades, but most of the woes, North Korea accepted, have derived from the establishment of the state of Israel and the death battle to the death between the whole Islamic Arab world and the West and Israel as they see it.
Yep.
I couldn't think of a more incendiary action. It's just like throwing gasoline into the fire.
The one thing, though, that I would I guess 2 points I would look at. One is that, if it is a U.S. embassy, obviously it's something that we, as the country, have the right to decide where the embassy will be located. But as far as just by virtue of moving an embassy, that doesn't automatically by default mean that country's capital has now moved. I wouldn't think. Is that correct or not?
No. Yeah. But usually you put an embassy in the capital. Mm.
I know that, for example, just kind of on a comparative basis, right, there had been a time when the U.S. Embassy was located in the Vatican, in the Holy See.
You're ahead of me. That was my next question. I was going to put you on the spot.
The U.S. decided back in 2014 to move it from there to a more neutral location that still recognizes the Vatican State, but it's not actually located there where it had been. And that was purely our prerogative, as a country, to decide where to put the embassy.
No, go back further. For many decades, it was unthinkable to the U.S. to even have an embassy or an ambassador to the Vatican, because we saw ourselves as a Protestant society, and this was, again, recognizing as a state what we saw as a religion and an uncomfortable relationship to that religion to boot. And as I remember the story, Richard Nixon took it upon himself to send an emissary, not a full ambassador, and our modern presidential icon, President Reagan, established full diplomatic relationship. Again,
1984.
It was just as preemptive as Trump's action on Jerusalem. And in both cases, I think they were running ahead of the popular view at this late point. I don't think America cares about it. Mm-hmm. But I can remember very clearly, and this is just out for general musings, But I can remember very clearly about the best part of 10 years ago going to Rome and going to a reception held at the U.S. ambassador's residence, U.S. ambassador to the Holy See. Now, it wasn't really in the Holy See because it's not big enough for embassy. Well, maybe it's big enough, but they don't want them there. So it was in Rome, just across the circus, Roman circus, looking to Vatican City on the hill across. And I was interested to see what it would be like, because I've been in a few ambassadors' residences, and they're usually a shrine to the country they represent. I went to this, as we entered the door of this ambassador's residence, it was a shrine to Roman Catholicism and to the Vatican. Very telling. And this was at the time of the George Bush administration. And to this day, I can't say why, but as we came in the antechamber, there was a picture of Cheney there, no picture of George Bush. So it was an aberrant ambassadorial presence. And I think that's just sort of consistent with the whole thing. It grew up like Topsy. It's a funny fit because, yes, on a certain level, the modern world, I think, would have to recognize Rome. You know, they have a diplomatic cadre that are everywhere. So no modern state can ignore them. That would be to their peril. But it's sort of improper, in my view, that a church is so politically active and involved and a power player like that. And here we're acknowledging them as a state, and yet it isn't really a state. So even the ambassador's residence is sort of a religious icon. Very problematic.
There's a couple of things, historical points I'd kind of develop off of that. You know, when we go back and look during the Roman Empire in the first couple of centuries of this era, when Christianity had started there, the concern with the Roman Empire was not so much that Christianity was just another religion, or that it was something that was there to lead its adherents to worship Christ as Lord and Savior. In Rome at the time, they had what was called a religio licita, those that are lawful religions. And any religion that was a religio licita was just afforded the opportunity to exist and practice its faith.
It's like in our modern era, France played with the idea of registering religions, the acceptable religions, and if you were deregistered, it's not that you were imprisoned, but you didn't have
official
permits and all the rest, so you could be sort of driven out of existence.
The concern then, going back with the Roman Empire, was that they recognized within several decades that Christianity was teaching the converts that their supreme allegiance was to be given to the Lord Jesus Christ and not to the Roman emperor. So for them, it became an issue of, in essence, patriotism or fealty to the Roman Empire. And that's why they started cracking down and persecuting the Christians. So there is an element of the aspect of supreme allegiance being given to the Lord Jesus Christ that for some states, even in the modern context, it is threatening, because, you know, if you have citizens that they're loyal to your country and your government unless there's something that violates their higher norms and their ultimate allegiance. You know, if one said that they could become organized into a unified body, they might present a challenge. So flipping that around from the Roman Catholic perspective, one of the reasons that the Pope does claim to have diplomatic status in going into other countries is if Catholics have a presence there, he says, as the shepherd of his flock, he has that prerogative. So that's where, again, there comes into the conflict between church and state, is that, do you recognize him as a purely spiritual religious leader, or is he coming in to make political pronouncements against the prevailing order of that government that might be harming its citizens?
I picked up on a story recently from a dead man. I was looking online. I do a lot of time. I do have a little in common with Trump, with President Trump. He spends the hours of the night watching TV or cruising the internet. And I watch a lot of documentaries and historical clippings on YouTube. And I found an interview with now deceased Chavez of what's the country? Venezuela, President Chavez. And some of our viewers may remember that in the build-up to the Iraq War, there was an abortive coup to overthrow him. The CIA were implicated in it. And I think the intention was to put a more friendly regime in place so that we could guarantee oil supply as we headed off to the Middle East. Well, it failed. And he was our vocal enemy from then on. He never did anything bad. In fact, he heaped some coals on our head during a tough time, gave away free gasoline in New York State, I remember, to sort of show us off. But anyway, he's dead now. But I saw this interview with him, and he explained how the coup took place. And he said he was sitting in his office when the military came in to arrest him, and they said, "You've been deposed. This is a new government now. You're under arrest, coming back to headquarters with us." And he said they turned on the television, and he saw the edicts from his successors. They were already governing and they had control of the television and radio stations, and they were passing new edicts and laws and announcing this was the end of his regime. So he was taken back to headquarters, where he got to talking with the soldiers, and he says, "I'm one of you," because I think he was a paratrooper, and "I'm one of you. Why are you doing this stuff?" And he talked them around. So in the end, they brought him back to the palace, reinstated him in his office, seated him there, and he resumed governing. Meanwhile, the television's broadcasting all the new stuff. Things are carrying on as though it was a full coup. And he said, while he's sitting at his office, a Roman Catholic cardinal came in the side door with a prepared paper of resignation. And he said, put it in front of him, and he says, "You must sign this immediately." He says, your life is in peril if you don't sign it. In other words, threatening him. And Chavez said, he says, "You are the one that's a threat." He says, "I'm back in power again." He says, "You should leave immediately." He said he scurried out the side door, and then I read on the news, read on the news that, forget the cardinal's name, he was suddenly withdrawn to Rome. Got caught with his hand in the cookie jar. He was playing in the middle of power politics in that country. And you could say Chavez should have gone, he was bad and all the rest. But it's very telling that here a church was one of the principal players in a military coup to overthrow a guy. And he's actually delivering the resignation letter and asking, "Sign it."
Well, that's something that I haven't had a chance to see that video. Yeah. I can look it up. But just generally speaking, I would say, yeah, there are times when religious entities have been involved in
many times, and not just the Roman Catholic Church.
But I mean, let me throw out one example.
Many Protestants, even today, I mean, the evangelical group here have got their hand in the cookie jar of anti-gay hatred in Africa. They've gone over there and fired them up, and who knows what they tell them, but the minute they leave, they've passed laws with death penalties for gays and so on. I'm not pro-gay, but I'm pro-life, human life. I don't think religions have the right to use civil power to execute people they don't like that. So it's not just Catholics.
Yeah, another quick example of that, though, dating back to 2500 BC, in Sumerian society, where the Babylonian Empire had its origins, there were individuals that were known as the En and the Lugal. The En was the cultic priest, the Lugal was the civic leader. And
I hadn't heard those terms.
Yeah, and there was a time period back around the middle of the first dynasty period that those two roles actually blended into one, so that the individuals assumed both a civic function as well as a cultic role. And then a couple of centuries after that, there was ensuing debate regarding that particular role and the people that were taxed by it.
Very interesting history. So stay with us, and you'll find out a lot more if you stay with this discussion. We'll be back after a short break. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break, we were talking about Sumer. Now, that's not the latest TV video game, is it?
No, it's not.
SimCity or Sumer City.
That's correct.
But it was interesting to me. I hadn't heard the terms of the two elements that merged.
Yep, that was in Sumerian society back in the early dynastic period. That it was roughly around 2500 BC when you had an individual that was referred to as the En, that was the cultic leader, and then the Lugal, that was just a civic leader. And the civic leader typically would only be elected and come into power whenever there was a crisis threatening the community. Other than that, he had no distinct role or function. And all of the community basically revolved around the role of the En, the religious leader. But in following centuries, those two roles actually reached a point where they merged, and it became a perpetual or permanent role between the N and the Lugal united together as one. In essence, church and state
And I'm
developing
trying to think
together.
of the name of the deity. N was very similar, wasn't it? What was the name of the deity?
It was Bel. Among the Babylonians, it was Bel, the god that they
this
worshipped.
was pre-Babylon.
Correct. Yes, that this was the preceding the Babylonian Empire.
Or am I
It was during-
thinking of the
Enuma Elish?
Noah figure?
Enuma Elish, the epic Gilgamesh and stuff dealing with the
but
flood.
not Gilgamesh. Anyhow, I know there was a deity that sounded very much like that, so
Yep.
I thought the priest took the name of the deity. But it is a little troubling.
But let me add a few other little points from the historical narrative. So that's what those two roles merged for a period of time. But what led to the conflict later on is that the citizens, the people living there, had to pay temple taxes. So when you had the civic role combined with the religious role, the guardian of the temple cultic rite figured into one person. He ended up overtaxing the people and requiring things of them that he had not done before. So in essence, it was an abuse of power.
Yeah.
And so the people began to protest against that, and that's what led to ensuing conflict.
Now, in the break, I was sharing with you about Cardinal Wolsey and his role in facilitating Henry VIII's great matter, the divorce. And in a lot of the modern retellings, that was what was going on to cause the Reformation. And of course, that's not right.
Correct.
There were very real doctrinal things. But you're alluding to something that was central in the Reformation in England and elsewhere. It was control of church property and legal prerogatives that the church had claimed.
Correct.
Like in England, it's amazing. At that time, they had civil courts and church courts. But the church courts, you could appeal to a church court. You could be brought before a church court for murder or whatever, and they would penalize you. And it just aggravated the king, Henry VIII, but other kings too, that there was a particular case in his time where a priest murdered someone, but the church would try him, and even as today, the priests are treated very kindly by their own organization. So he basically got off free.
Correct.
And then the matter of taxes or non-tax paying by the church properties that were accumulating wealth. First thing Henry VIII did when he declared himself head of the church was appropriate all the wealth of the church, which was avaricious as far as the king himself, but it represented the payoff of a long frustration of the people themselves. They saw here a church power that was claiming financial and legal prerogatives to itself.
Correct.
And it was disruptive, even to a medieval society.
In fact, I would say that it was those same concerns that was instrumental in the Mexican Revolution back in the 1850s, during the 1850s, with Simon Bolivar. That led to, in essence, Mexico becoming, if we could use the term, a secular state, meaning they didn't officially recognize Roman Catholicism or any other religion. But some of the excesses of the church prior to the Mexican Revolution was that the church owned up to at least half of all of the property of the country of Mexico was under in the name of the church.
You read Liberty as well as Right for It. We had that as a cover article once. Yeah. I'm trying to think of the name they gave to the war, but at one point Mexico basically outlawed Roman Catholicism and murdered a number of priests, and it was not a good time. I think it was a severe and violent overreaction to this encroachment of the Catholic Church on the prerogatives of the state.
Yep. So there's a history not just within Western civilization or not just particular to Christianity, but across the board, religion in general, anytime that it exceeds its bounds of trying to lead mankind to the transcendental and tries to begin usurping authority in the temporal realm, that's when conflicts always develop.
And it's natural because all religions pretty much claim you lock, stock and barrel. They're dealing with your destiny of your very life and your ongoing existence in the afterworld and so on. So true religionists finds it very hard to separate that from the mundane things of life. But what they forget is when they gain control of the government or the civil structure for their particular viewpoint, by definition, they're now enforcing or even harming those that think a little differently.
Yep.
That's where
and
the
that's why,
problem
you
is.
know, again, coming back to the modern concept of the state, you know, the way it's established, whether one looks at it as predominantly instrumental through the Enlightenment or through the Protestant Reformation viewpoints, or even just aspects of, one would say, maybe atheistic viewpoints of establishing a secular state, there were a variety of educational and philosophical viewpoints that contributed to that development.
Absolutely.
But nonetheless, it is something that, you know, in America we have the American experiment that it has proven successful. We've got societal peace, even though we've got diversity of religious groups here in America. There's ongoing tensions, yes. There's always issues that come up before courts at the lower level and even up to the level of the Supreme Court dealing with church-state issues. But I think that's what the Founding Fathers envisioned, was having two, in essence, one can say, perspectives or strains of thought that were balancing to one to the other, and that is how each generation of Americans debate these issues and hammer out what is the best for the prevailing circumstances.
Yeah, I generally agree with you.
You say generally.
I have a slightly different take on history. You know, the human beings living in the United States are not exempt from the way human beings function in relation to anything, including religion. I think what's largely protected the US from the religious wars of the old world is we haven't really had monolithic divisions within the society. Mm-hmm. There is, even Protestantism is divided into thousands, probably an understatement, thousands of little sects. And there's always this bubbling discontent between each. And at odd occasions, there have even been some egregious and even violent moves, like against the Mormons, the extermination policy of the governor of Illinois. That's pretty amazing. Yep. And against the indigenous peoples in their views of the Great Spirit, and that, they didn't get far. But we haven't had anything, and what you mentioned, the framers of the US government, great men. What had to have been in their minds was the English religious civil war of barely a lifetime before, where you had Catholics, at least the king and his cavaliers who had Catholic interests at mind, as people saw it, and the Puritans. So yeah, they wanted to avoid that, and I think they did a good job in creating a more neutral playing ground. But we do have simmering discontents. In some ways, they're more constant than the old world. You don't hear about general religious challenges in Europe now. It's said to be secular. I think that's an illusion, but it's not bubbling and boiling with religious prerogatives and rivalries and so on. Unfortunately, Romanism on the rise has become so dominant, there's not much going on. Even the old Protestant forces are gone. But America is hardly a passive environment, but it dissipates more easily because of its balkanized nature and of this protective element of the Constitution. You're absolutely right.
So maybe one could look at that even as saying the idea of federalism as a concept, you know, an entity that can take its role as a neutral body over these other religious organizations in society. Yeah.
And the level playing field that everyone's always talking about is never attained, but that's a good ideal, and it works well for religious freedom. We don't have time now. We could talk about secularism, but I think the United States is not secular, never has been secular, but the government has always been of a secular, neutral structure. But to say that American society is secular is missing the point totally, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, because we have religion that is woven throughout society from our founding to the present time.
You know, we're pushing for separation of church and state, but to be vulnerable to the charge that you're secularist and you're against religion, I mean, we never want to say such a thing. Religion is a necessary element in human existence, especially true religion, as the Bible says.
Yes. Religion, in the American context, most definitively identifies our country as being not a secular country, but one in which the government respects a benevolent neutrality. That is to say that government doesn't promote nor prohibit religion, and instead allows religion to flounder or flourish on its own. That's the original viewpoint of the Founding Fathers, and that is also what was written in the First Amendment, the religion clauses that provide that balance between government and religion in American society.
Sometime after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives, very close by the way, only a few hundred yards away, looked down on the city and the great temple, and said that one day not one stone would be left upon another. Actually, for 400 years or so, it was not clear to anyone where the temple had actually been, and to this day it's not definitively known. But for three faiths at least, Jerusalem is a city that is worth fighting over and has been fought over. And it's curious that in this day and age, so far removed from the Crusades and the other antagonisms, America, the greatest power and a nominally religious society, would be party to proclaiming Jerusalem the capital of a revitalized Jewish state. We will see where this takes us. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.